Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this lesson is we're going to be looking at the concept of what the rival plans for Reconstruction were coming out of the Civil War. What you should be able to do at the end of this lesson is students should be able to review the causes and consequences of the Civil War, assess the influence of significant people and groups on Reconstruction, describe the issues that divided Republicans during early Reconstruction, and distinguish the freedoms guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Terms to know: Reconstruction, Radical Republican, Wade-Davis Bill, Freedmen's Bureau, Andrew Johnson, Black Codes, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the 14th Amendment, impeach, and the 15th Amendment. So, what we have to look at here is how would the Southern economy be rebuilt after the Civil War? Because we have to realize there's a major amount of destruction that takes place. We talked previously about Sherman's march to the sea and how really his actions largely destroy much of the infrastructure that exists within the South. And then we look at some of the other concepts that existed, because during the Civil War, the South's percentage of national wealth had fallen from 30% of the country's overall wealth to just 12%. And we had a quarter of men aged between 20 and 40 that had died. And this took much of the South's workforce with it. So you've got this major labor shortage that exists, as you're trying to rebuild a society that has largely been destroyed. The South also needed to find a way to handle their newly freed slaves, African-American populations, because, you have a huge influx of individuals now who really have no place within society, because you've got a social structure that is still extremely racist, that really isn't welcoming of these newly freed slaves. And they're still living in the South, which is very detrimental to them being able to have any sort of success. Some proposed redistributing Southern land to newly freed slaves in order to provide them a way to support themselves. The radical Republicans really pushed this concept. A lot of people rejected this course of action, though, even a lot of African Americans, who felt that what should happen is that Southerners should be paid for their land and that it should be sold at a fair price to the newly freedmen. Because African Americans at this point don't want to be looked upon as being dependent upon the government, and they don't want to be looked at as a needy society that has to have things given to them. What they're looking at trying to accomplish is getting this land at a fair price that they know that they would never be able to actually buy from Southerners for a fair price. So after figuring out what to do with the economy and looking at some of the economic issues that existed, we've also got to figure out how will the Southern states rejoin the Union. During the era of Reconstruction, the government needed to determine how it would handle allowing the Southern states back. Lincoln proposed a moderate approach to allowing states readmission to the Union. Lincoln had, in 1863, issued a proclamation of amnesty in Reconstruction, and this stated that if 10% of state voters swore allegiance to the Union, that state could set up a new government and be readmitted into the Union without penalty. If the state abolished slavery and provided education for African Americans, the state would regain representation in Congress. Lincoln also wanted to grant pardons to former Confederates. So when you look at this plan, it's a very moderate plan. This is something that Lincoln is going out of his way to ensure that the South feels good about coming back into the Union. He's trying to ensure that they don't feel punished, because in his view, the best way to put the Union together is to reunify everybody, to make them all feel like they're part of one common concept, which is something that goes a long way to try and rebuild the health of the country. The issue here, though, is that even though Lincoln has tried to put this plan into place, there are a lot of individuals within the government that really hate the idea of just allowing the South back in without being, hurt, and they really want to punish them for their role in the Civil War. So the radical Republicans sought to punish the South for their actions and really rejected Lincoln's 10% plan, and they looked at it as being something that was not nearly punitive enough to allow the South back in. So the radical Republicans pushed for full citizenship of African Americans, and they wanted to ensure that voting rights for newly freed African Americans were put into place as well. So they drafted something called the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864, which was in response to Lincoln's 10% plan. The bill required that a majority of states' pre-war voters swear loyalty to the Union, and demanded African American equality. The measure was, however, stopped by the use of a pocket veto. And a pocket veto takes place during the last 10 days of a congressional session, and this is when the president does not sign a bill and lets it expire. And if a president does that in the last 10 days of a congressional session, that bill has to start the entire legislative process over again once Congress reconvenes. Lincoln was able to get radical Republican support for the Freedmen's Bureau. This organization was created in order to reunite families separated by slavery, to negotiate fair labor contracts between former slaves and white landowners, by representing African Americans in court, and by establishing a precedent that black citizens had full legal rights. Many of these things being done in order to try and undo the damage that had been done by the Dred Scott case, which we talked about previously. So, standards check. How did Lincoln and the radical Republicans differ in their approach to Reconstruction? So we look at Johnson's Reconstruction plan. Johnson, like Lincoln, wanted to restore the political status of the northern states quickly and without punishing them. Johnson required the southern states ratify the 13th Amendment and draft a state constitution that outlawed slavery. Johnson also sought to restore the land's rights to all that were pardoned, but the way that you could get pardoned and the way to get your land rights back is that you actually had to personally write Johnson in order to be able to get him to grant you those. Johnson really reveled in the fact that the South was dependent upon him and that he was kind of the individual that got to dictate a lot of the things as far as how the South came back into the Union. Despite Johnson's requirement that slavery be outlawed, he did not seek to push racial equality, as he favored a government for white men only. And that's the thing that we have to understand, that except for the radical Republicans, who were trying to push for racial equality, most Republicans, all Democrats really, did not see African Americans as being equal within the system. They very much thought that the white man was superior and that there was no way that a black person was going to be able to function correctly within American society. So we look at the concepts and some of the difficulties that came along with black rights in this Reconstruction period. Due to Johnson's lack of requirements for racial equality and suffrage, and his strong support of state rights, Southern states sought to suppress black political rights. And the way they did this was largely through something referred to as the Black Codes. The Black Codes sought to limit African American rights and keep them as landless workers. And the way that it did this, and some of the punishments that came along with that, is that it required blacks to work in a very limited number of jobs. And if you take this huge number of newly freed slaves and you make them work in a limited status, it's very difficult for all of them to find jobs. And it stipulated that any black person who did not have a job could be arrested and sent to prison. You know, this is despite the fact that you have a huge number of whites now who are coming out of the Civil War that don't have jobs, that don't have farms, that are poor, that can't read, that can't do any of these things. That these are laws that were very much targeted to try and take these newly freed black individuals and get them out of the Southern society. And it failed to punish those who used violence and intimidation against blacks. And this very much sets a groundwork for a lot of violence within the United States and a lot of institutional segregation and poor treatment of African Americans in the United States. In response to these actions, Congress refused to allow Southern congressmen to take their seats. Congress also tried to pass laws that would allow the Freedmen's Bureau to punish those who did not protect the civil rights of African Americans, and attempted to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that sought to overturn the Black Codes. Johnson accused the radical Republicans of trying to Africanize the South and vetoed both measures. At this point, Johnson is a very, very unpopular individual. And he's looked at as really being a roadblock to the type of Reconstruction plans that the radical Republicans have tried to put in place at this point. So you've got the 14th Amendment to the Constitution as proposed. And what this does is it does a few things. It reestablishes the concept of due process. It reestablishes the concept of privileges and immunities, which states that if you go from one state to another, you're protected by that state's laws, things that are already in the Constitution. But there are two huge things that it does that are really monumental throughout American history. Is that it states that anybody who's born on American soil is an American citizen. And this is, once again, to undo a lot of the things that were established under the Dred Scott case. It establishes all African Americans in the United States as being citizens. And it states that nobody can be, or it states that all people are equally protected under the law. All citizens are equally protected under the law. And this is to try and really ensure that African Americans are legally given equal footing within the United States. The amendment also revoked representation to states that refused to allow African Americans to vote and made it illegal to allow leading Confederate generals the ability to serve in public office. The Radical Republicans also passed the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, and this divided the southern states into military districts, 5 of them, that the Union Army would possess and would force these provisions into the society. Once the state had ratified the 14th Amendment and had passed a state constitution that made slavery illegal, the military rule would be lifted and the state would be allowed to re-enter the Union. So because of the issues that Andrew Johnson has kind of put in place at this point, because of the thorn in the side he's been of the Radical Republicans, who were really the ones kind of spearheading the Reconstruction effort at this point, they're looking for any sort of advantage that they can get over Andrew Johnson. And what they end up doing is they end up taking a law that had been put in place. It's referred to as the Tenure of Office Act. And what this act stated was that if you, as president, tried to fire a cabinet member before the end of the term, you had committed an illegal act. And Johnson tried to fire Edward Stanton, his Secretary of War, before the end of that term was over. So the Radical Republicans seize upon this opportunity. They very quickly look at this as, all right, Johnson's committed an illegal act, let's impeach him. Now, we really have to understand the concept of impeachment because largely the term impeachment is used incorrectly. A lot of people look at it as if you impeach somebody that you are removing them from office, and that's not true at all. When you impeach somebody, what you are doing is you are taking a public official and you are putting them on trial to be able to determine whether or not they've done something illegal enough to be removed from office. So it's a process here. So in order for impeachment to take place, you have to have a majority vote in the House of Representatives, and you have to have a 2/3 vote in the Senate. Andrew Johnson manages to escape actually being removed from office by 1 vote in the Senate. The law that Johnson had been impeached for violating was also later found unconstitutional. So if he had been removed, that he would have been removed for violating an unconstitutional law, which in hindsight, we would have looked at that as being a very poor decision. So in 1869, with a little more support from Johnson, now that he knows that Congress isn't screwing around and that they're coming for him, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, and this forbids any state from denying suffrage on the grounds of race, color, or previous servitude. We now have 3 amendments, our Civil War amendments, the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship and guarantees equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which now states that African Americans have the right to vote. This was largely done because of the impact African American voters had had on the election of 1868, and the fact that Grant, who wins that race, he wins that race largely because of the African American vote. If he had not gotten the African American vote like he had, he would have never been president. So immediately we see an election where African American voters have a major sway and major impact on who actually becomes president. So let's do our standards check here. What freedoms were guaranteed under the 14th and 15th Amendment? How did Johnson and the Radical Republican differ in their approach to Reconstruction? And how did Lincoln, Johnson, and the Radical Republicans shape the Reconstruction of the South?